and secret missions to hide the world from forbidden knowledge. And of course, giant humanoids existing in the caverns within the hollow earth. If you can imagine anything from unfathomable to weird, the conspiracy theory iceberg has you covered. Now, as many of you probably know, this is a series that I finished a few months ago. However, in the beginning, this was the series that jump-started my channel. And I understand that it can be a lot to go back to the beginning now and then watch the whole thing from square one. So to make it a bit easier for you, I made this video where I took out all of the intros and outros to give you one straight run through of the entire series. Now, like I said, I began this series right whenever I was starting out on YouTube. Because of that, I really didn't know what I was doing from a presentation or technical angle. So because of that, the first couple videos in the series are just me talking into an iPhone camera with no microphone. And I totally understand if that's too amateur or grating for you. So to make it a bit easier, in the description I have put timestamps for where each original video began and left off at. So if you don't feel like you want to sit through one of the videos, you can go to the timestamp and skip forward to the next one and see if it's any better. But I can confidently say, given the vast amount of topics and insanity that this iceberg covers, I know there's something in there for you. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the series, but first of all, and as always, thank you for watching. Boy, am I excited. So there's been this image floating around for a while called the iceberg conspiracy list. And for those of you that don't know, it is a picture of an iceberg, and on it there are several separate tiers that gauge conspiracy theories from how known they are to how unknown they are. I'll actually throw it up now so you can look at it. As you can see, it is huge. There are several variations, but I think this one is the best, not only because it is the most well structured with different tiers and specifics for what each tier means, but it also is the most comprehensive. As I tried to find research for this, I'm telling you there was none. Like, no one had done a full breakdown of it. There's a couple people who did one or two, and then after researching it, people were saying that everyone who did full reviews of it was having their videos taken down. So we'll see what happens. So I decided, who better to do it than me? Technically a lot of people, that doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is, because this thing is huge, every one of these phrases can lead you down an entire rabbit hole of research and investigation. Some of them are well-known stuff like UFOs or Bigfoot, but as you get into some of these later ones, it gets creepy. Like, you drag over some pretty scary ones like human flesh markets or children trapped in floors and things such as, but once you get really far into it, like tier 9, tier 10 stuff, it gets like God's ego death, or the universe was created as a test, and things like that that have like these whole networks and stories behind them, but just aren't commonly known. And I'll go ahead and say right now, none of what I'm talking about means I believe it per se. I'm simply conveying what the conspiracy is because I think it's cool, and some of these are awesome. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to do a quick run through of the tier 1, and then the next video will be tier 2, and etc. Like I said, the further you go down, the more crazy they get, so this one's pretty much to whet your appetite. Although there is a lot of cool stuff at this tier that I learned in research for this video. Some of the ones we'll get into in later videos are absolutely crazy, like the City of Broken Candles or the Valley of Headless Men and things such as. But like I said, I'm going to go through the entire chart, so we're starting with tier 1. The title and description for tier 1 is Crazy Head, and the description reads, Mainstream Conspiracies and Unsolved Mysteries. Most of this stuff is well documented and known to a good portion of the Western citizens. A lot of common theories may be grouped in broader terms, or may not even appear on the chart at all considering their meaning and popularity. Also, quick disclaimer on this first tier, this doesn't really apply to the others, but some of these are so well known, or you've heard so many times, I'm not even going to cover them, like fake news, or Bigfoot, or UFOs, like, we all get it. I don't need to go into detail about them. But without further ado, let's get into this, and thank you for watching. First up, we have Big Pharma. Most of you know about this. It's pretty much just a huge encompassing theory that pharmaceutical companies suppress vaccines and cures that are made in order to make money off of treatment. Next, we have Atlantis. Original records of Atlantis date back to Greek times, I believe, between Sparta and Athens, of a continent located somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And since they couldn't have got to North America, that would require there to be something in between that has since disappeared or sank. Next up, we have one of the first ones that I didn't know about until getting into this, and that is Nostradamus. Nostradamus was an old philosopher who came up with several of the constellations and discovering the night sky, and it is believed that several of his predictions came true later, such as World War II and the Great London Fire. However, from doing my own research, this is kind of BS because, like for example, the London Fire, he said that there would be bad things happening in London, and then a bad thing happened in London, so yeah. The Mandela Effect. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but it essentially says that there are parallel universes that cross over with each other in minor ways that we're not aware of. For example, those who remember the Bernstein Bears from their childhood may be surprised to know that it's actually the Bernstein Bears, and that several discrepancies like that exist. Like the Monopoly Man has no monocle, and yada yada yada. This is a cool one, it's very deep, it goes on for itself, so if you're interested, check it out. Next is Malaysian Flight 370, which disappeared somewhere over the Indian Ocean. The conspiracy states that there is a U.S. military base there, and more than likely the plane was either hijacked and flying towards it, or flew too close to it, to which the U.S. military shot it down and covered up all evidence of it, although practically I feel that there's a lot of moving parts in that couldn't be kept secret for so long. The GMO conspiracy regards GMOs that are in several foods from fast food and markets and things such as, which are used in this conspiracy to cause food shortages and hunger in people, so essentially the whole get the customer addicted idea. Orbs is rather vague. From what I figured out, it's referring to the orbs that are seen in photographs when taken in the sunlight. So, you know, dust, particles, things such as, but the conspiracy says that it is a paranormal or supernatural occurrence, so yeah. The New World Order, for those that aren't familiar, in the book of Revelations in the Bible, it details that there will be a one world government, one world order in the end times, and this will be in much more specific detail as we get later on into the iceberg, but at this tier, it's basically just referring to the idea that all governments want to come together to make one government. I know I keep, advertising later into the iceberg, but there's good reason for it. Some of the ones down there are insane, and get into specifics of how one world government can be achieved and things such as. So stay tuned. Next is the Nibiru Cataclysm. Nibiru is a planet, or also known as Planet X, that was predicted by a scientist in 2003 to collide with the Earth in 2003. So pretty well debunked. But the term is still used to apply to an idea that a meteor or any other body could hit the planet one day and kill us all. Now we get into the fun stuff. The Bilderberg meetings is an event that really does happen every year, in which Western economists meet with European governments to discuss capitalism in the West from all the evidence I could find. Obviously, there are several theories that come from this, especially since the fact the press isn't allowed and there are no notes to be taken. So a group of world elites talking behind closed doors in high places. Nice. Transhumanism is more of a philosophy than a theory, really. It applies a lot to anarchist rings, oddly enough, and it's essentially the idea that humans can be further expounded on or bettered through augmentation of computer parts and cybernetics and things such as. BEK, or black-eyed kids, is a recurring phenomenon in the supernatural community of small children appearing with blacked out eyes. You can follow this rabbit trail pretty far, but pretty much surface level, it's just creepy kids who appear whenever tragedy happens. So people chalk it up to ghosts or extraterrestrials or what have you. Next is Antarctica, which there is a slew of Antarctic conspiracy theories. Everything ranging from giant holes appearing in the middle of Antarctica, to government bases being down there, to that's where the world elites hide. I mean, you could spin forever on this, so moving on. Next is the basement tapes. For those of you that don't know, before the Columbine shooting, the two shooters made a series of videos detailing what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, and generally talking about how they hate people in their school and there needs to be a cleansing and things such as. These tapes still exist, although the conspiracy resides in no one knows who has them. However, randomly portions of them will appear online, leaving people to believe that they're out there maybe exchanging hands, but no one knows where they're at. Next up, we've got Operation Northwoods. This is a rather well-documented case, but essentially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was reports put out by the CIA that said to warrant a war with Cuba, they should commit acts of terrorism against U.S. citizens and then blame them on Cuba to justify a war. Which, yep, Next up is PSYOPs. This is also well documented. Just the fact that specifically the U.S. government, as well as other governments, is known to employ psychological warfare, from noises to conditions and supply rations and things like that. The Vela incident is an event occurred off the coast of South Africa in 1979. What happened is a system of satellites known as the Vela satellites captured 2 back-to-back giant flashes for seemingly no reason. However, after reading into it, it was probably just an unsanctioned nuclear test because this satellite system had caught them before and they looked similar, and the whole conspiracy is just because there was no scripted test that day. So yeah, probably just nuke testing. Next we have giants. While this one seems vague, later tiers get into it more specifically, but essentially in the Old Testament of the Bible there are several references to giants happening, and obviously today there doesn't seem to be any. However, this conspiracy, as we get into it later, applies to the deep state and cover-ups and things such as, so I don't want to spoil any of it yet, but this is a good mention that asterisk mark, so to speak. We'll get to it later. Padma McCord is an interesting one. There's a lady online by the name of Padma McCord who owns, for some reason, thousands, if not millions of URLs, which, looking at this on the outside, you'd say, oh, it's some company using a name or whatever, until you go to the URLs and it's just pictures of her face photoshopped onto other women for some reason. And every one of these websites has millions of backlinks to other websites, which someone who knows tech may know more about it than I do. I have no clue why. It's just creepy. The Elisa Lam incident. For those who haven't trolled around on creepy internet videos like I have, you may not know who Elisa Lam is. But it is a story that is worth your time. She was a college student, I believe, at the Hotel Cecil in California, who for some reason, it's seen in security camera videos, runs onto an elevator, freaking out, keeps jerking around thinking something's following her, runs to her room, and is never seen alive again until she's found 3 days later in the water tank of the hotel. There was never any evidence of a killing, no one was ever found in connection to it, and it is one of the wildest videos ever to watch, knowing that she was never followed and there was never evidence of anyone following her. It's really strange. I'll leave you to look into this one yourself, but it was one of the first videos I remember that kind of got me into this whole, I don't know, like creepy, dark web, whatever. The Terry Calico picture. This one's just sad. There was a woman named Terry Calico who was suspected to be abducted in the early 90s, and then a few months later, a picture of her bound and gagged turned up in a parking lot around the area she was kidnapped. It leaves a lot of questions of why the picture was left there and what any of it means, especially since it was just in some random convenience store parking lot. But like I said, this is just sad. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon. I have never heard of this one before until researching it, but apparently in the 40s there was a series of gas attacks that occurred in Mattoon, Illinois, which investigators mostly chalked up to mass hysteria and people who left their fuel lines running, but everyone who it happened to, which was dozens of cases, claimed that it was an individual that ran up to them and attacked them with invisible gas. So yeah, have fun with that one. COINTELPRO. Like Operation Northwoods, this one's pretty well documented and known at this point, but essentially, before the Patriot Act became a thing, it's evidence of the FBI illegally spying on U.S. citizens to gain information, and blah blah blah, yeah, government bad. The Mao-Yale connection. This one pretty much just says that the old communist emperor of China, Mao Zedong, was in secret connections with Yale University in ways to indoctrinate students and receive funding from them and vice versa. From what I've seen, it's mostly just conspiracy jargon, but you can check it out for yourself. The I-70 killer. This is referring in the spring of 1992, there was a series of 6 murders of gas station clerks on the I-70 interstate, and no one was ever caught, but some sketches were given. From everything I've found, this is simply just a serial killer string that went unsolved. The Majestic 12 is a reference to a board member of 12 people put together by Harry Truman in 1947 to recover all alien spacecraft information and things such as. This relates back to Area 51, although it's a bit more specific in saying that there's a committee, so to speak, that looks over anything that happens with extraterrestrials. Also, Area 51 was also in this first tier list, but like I said, it's one of those that's so obvious there's no reason for me to talk about it. Red Squads are, again, a pretty well documented government thing that during the whole Red Scare of the 50s and 60s, there were groups of US police officers whose sole purpose was to hunt down communist sympathizers and arrest them for whatever. The Secret was really hard to find information on because it's such a vague title, but given its italics, I think it's referring to a book that essentially is a self-help book that says, thinking certain thoughts deliberately will change the course of your life. So, not sure why it's on there, but we're still in tier 1, so whatever. Acupuncture is an interesting one. This relates back to the big pharma I mentioned at the beginning, and essentially says that acupuncture heals several diseases, but it is purposely put down and not given attention by mainstream media and doctors because it would put them out of business. So it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. The Max Headroom incident is something that happened in 1987 in Chicago when 2 broadcast stations suddenly cut out and cut to a video of a man wearing a Max Headroom costume, which is a character from British television, who began talking random jargon and swearing and then had someone spank him on camera, and then the broadcast cut out. What's interesting is that there's never been anyone named a suspect, there was never any evidence found, and it's pretty much become a whole Reddit thread trying to figure out who this person was, what happened, and name them. So it's an interesting mystery to go on, but from everything I could find, it was just 2 guys messing with the media. And then for the last one I'm going to cover in tier 1, we have the UN agenda. This is pretty much just relates to Agenda 21 and other conspiracies, which I'll talk about more in later tiers, but the idea that the UN is trying to build itself towards a new world order. Tier 2's title is Deep Researcher, and it's described as theories and Twilight Zone level stuff. Most of these entries can easily be studied through the use of mainstream medias, but they require a good grasp of how the world works to be fully understood. Common people rarely go this deep. First up, we have lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is a well-known concept that during sleep, some people can control their dreams and what happens in them. I, for one, am one of these people. However, the theory comes in where people who can lucid dream can either affect things that happen in the real world or affect their thought process by manipulating things in the dreamscape. Next up is MK Ultra. MK Ultra is a rather well-known experiment that happened with the CIA in the 1970s, late 60s, in which people were brought in and influenced with psychotropics and other mind-altering drugs for the CIA to view the effects of and potentially use in psyops, which again was something mentioned in Tier 1. This is a rather well-known event. Most of the theories stem from the idea that either it's still going on or it was done at a great larger scale than the populace is aware of. Next up we have hypnosis. Again, this is one of those establishing theories, but as we all know, hypnosis is influencing the watcher to either recall things from the past or implant memories and yada yada things such as. Next up we have fluoride. Fluoride has to do with the fact that in the US, fluoride is inserted into the tap water in order to help with tooth enamel and digestion and yada yada things such as. The conspiracy comes from the fact that fluoride is a chemical and can therefore chemically castrate or influence other biomechanical things in the body. So this will be more tied in later, but such as pineal gland calcification is believed to be a side effect of fluoride poisoning or fluoride control, as people believe. Speaking of, pineal gland calcification is the idea that the pineal gland in the body calcifies after a certain point. This is actually true, however, the side effects of the theory are not. The way the pineal gland works is it has to do with growth and hormone supplements in the body, but after someone passes puberty, it's not really needed anymore and the gland simply calcifies and dies out. The theory comes from the idea that things such as fluoride and other things taken in the body causes the gland to calcify and keeps us from reaching either our full brain or physical potential. This goes into weird theories about how to uncalcify and things such as, but it is true that as you get older, you don't need the pineal gland anymore, so it kind of just withers away. Next up, we have Cicada. This is in reference to Cicada 3301, which was a large-scale codebreaker event that happened in 2012. A random account appeared with the name Cicada 3301 and had these large puzzles for people to solve. There have been a total of 3, with a new one being added every time the last one gets figured out. However, the third one, to this day, despite being posted in 2016, has still not been found out. The site says the reason for this is that they are recruiting code breakers for some kind of secret project that no one's aware of. It's a very interesting rabbit hole to go down. I may make a video on it someday. There's several videos out there, and give the third puzzle a look. You may be the code breaker that's wanted for whatever super sleuth activity they got planned. The McFly code is our first look at one of the more kooky ones. It is a belief that the Back to the Future movie predicted 9/11. The evidence of this is saying such as the shopping mall that takes place in the movie is Twin Pines Shopping Mall, or the fact that the first clock of the movie shows 9:55, which on a hand dial would be 9/11, and things such as, and this all connects to the idea that the people who did 9/11 make movies and blah blah blah, you get it. Dowsing, or is an idea that using a fork of metal, people can pick up on sonic vibrations from the earth in order to find underground supplies of water, oil, etc. It's more of a wives' tale than anything now, but there is some truth to it when it comes to how people used to found oil refineries. However, the way this leads back into a theory is it's one of those establishing ones again, that there are sonic vibrations within the earth. Next up we have Admiral Byrd, and this is one of the first really interesting ones in my opinion. Admiral Byrd was sent to Antarctica shortly after World War II in something called Operation High Jump, which was essentially an idea to figure out whatever the Nazis were looking for in Antarctica during World War II, which relates to this place called Base 221, which was supposedly a Nazi outpost in Antarctica. When he returned back, he was put into isolation for 36 hours and was told not to speak of what he found to anyone under any circumstances, to which he was then given the Medal of Honor and told to leave. While this is odd, many connect it to the idea of what the Nazis were looking for in the first place, which is something known as Agartha. Which brings us into our next topic, Agartha. In theory, Agartha is a civilization located beneath the Earth. This gets into a larger idea called Hollow Earth theory, that inside of the Earth, it is essentially a flipped gravitational pull, and there's an entire world operating beneath us. What's interesting throughout history is how different civilizations and leaders have been dedicated to finding this quote-unquote Agartha, such as Hitler during World War II, and other ancient tribes have tales of people that live beneath. How that's connected is since Agartha is what Germany was looking for in World War II, and since that's where Admiral Byrd went to go look and then was told to shut up and never talk about it, many believe Admiral Byrd found Agartha and then was told to simply never talk about it. Next up we have Weather Control, or HAARP. HAARP stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, which is an actual military base located in Alaska. The purpose of this base is to monitor weather activity, although many have accused it as being a weather control base, such as Hugo Chavez saying that the earthquakes that occurred in South America were due to meddling at the HAARP location in Alaska. This goes deeper. There's a lot of people who trace the weather around the area to look for signs on it, so you can check it out yourself. But basically the idea in Alaska that the government has a weather control base. Freemasons is another one of those establishing ideas. It essentially goes off of the well-known idea that the Masons are shady and they influence several politics and events that happen around the world. So this is another one of those asterisk ones. Keep the Masons in mind for things that come later. The 23 Enigma is simply that, an idea that the number 23 is suspicious throughout history in things such as dates and events, a number of casualties, and things such as. You can look at this one yourself. It's really long. There's even a movie about it starring Jim Carrey, but essentially the idea that the number 23 is to be avoided. Next up we have astral projection. Astral projection relates a lot to lucid dreaming, although it's a little bit different. The idea of astral projection is that while sleeping or in a trance-like state, someone can remove their soul or their consciousness from their body and walk around and influence things. Experiments with this include hospitals who have put messages on the roof, and people who claim to astrally project have projected above the hospital, so to speak, been able to read what was on the roof, come back down and tell the doctors what they saw. Next up, we have succubi. This will relate more in theories on, such as giants, but essentially the idea is that there are these supernatural entities disguised as women that feed off of men's energy by appearing as a sexual being or feeding off of their life force or things such as. Eastern philosophy is incredibly vague. I can only imagine this is also a setup, as it applies to Hinduism and Taoism, and just general ideas of spirituality, yin and yang, so on and so forth. Nephilim is what I was referring to earlier when speaking of giants. Nephilim is a more specific concept. Specifically in the Old Testament, it says that some of the angels that fell to earth whenever Satan was cast out had children with humans on earth, and that created creatures known as Nephilim, or giants. In the Old Testament, several of the tribes that were wiped out or ordered to be wiped out by God were these Nephilim creatures. Famous characters such as Goliath from the Bible are specific instances of it. Where this goes further is the idea that they still exist in modern day, or small tribes and civilizations are made up of them. The missing cosmonauts relates to the Cold War space race time before Yuri Gagarin was successfully shot into space, that Russia shot up several other people, but since they all died or never made it back to Earth, they simply kept it quiet as a way to not cause bad publicity during the Cold War. This one is definitely more feasible than others on the list, the idea that the Russian government would cover up failures in its space program, but it does make it horrifying to think about how many people could have died in the search for the man in space. The Dyaltov Pass is an interesting one that I will absolutely make a video on someday, but the short version is 9 researchers went missing in Russia in the Siberian area, and when they went to be found, they were all dead, either from having all of their bones shattered, their jaws ripped off, other horrifying scenarios that in no way seemed natural, to the point that the coroner's report on it says they were killed by a, quote, overwhelming compelling force, which could be literally anything. Like I said, it's a very interesting story and very creepy, and I encourage you to check it out yourself. Declassified documents is also super vague. This is probably just referring to the JFK files and other government documents that have been released in recent years, and the fact that they proved and disproved several conspiracy theories. So, yeah, go figure. Summoning is also a setup concept. Basically just the idea that people can bring in evil or good entities, either through actions or rituals. So specific supernatural beings can be conjured up by an individual. One of which is another concept on the iceberg, tulpas. Tulpas are what we would traditionally figure as an imaginary friend. Essentially the idea that someone can think an entity up so much and imagine them to the point that a spirit inhabits that being. So the idea that imaginary friends kids have, or ideas that always set in your mind, are not merely ideas but are now possessed by a specific entity. So don't worry about that monster under the bed too much. Operation Bluebeam was an idea put forward by Sergey, Monast, which said that NASA was working with the UN and world governments to pose a new religion in which NASA would fake the second coming of Christ in order to set up the Antichrist as the Godhead. And it essentially relates to the end of times, the idea that all world governments are working together to destroy the population, and he called this entire thing Operation Bluebeam. So yeah, occult knowledge is also a super vague one. Basically the just knowledge of the occult itself. So occult's defined as anything that is supernatural but not strictly spiritual. So werewolves, monsters, creatures of the night, etc., etc. Again, this is another setup. It just occurred to me that we are not even halfway done. Magica was weird to find anything for, mostly because I think there is a card game of the same name, but from the best I can figure, Magica is essentially the idea that magic is divided into 5 categories, that is the arcane, the illusionary, the aura, manipulation, and elemental. So I could be completely off, but that's all I could find. Next we have the shelled or firmament earth. This comes from the idea posed in Genesis in the Bible that before the flood, the earth was covered with a firmament, or essentially a wrapping of water that allowed oxygen to flourish and things such as. Now it's mentioned in the flood that that firmament was destroyed. However, theorists believe that there's still a firmament of some kind, and that the Earth sort of exists within a shell. And most of what I found with this related back to hollow Earth theory, so I think they're kind of tied, if not directly. Men in Black is a concept that is rather well known, that government agents who simply wear a suit and use fake names appear to cover up evidence often. This relates to theories such as Polybius, which we'll get into later, or people going missing, and it's essentially the deepest level of government cover-up you can go, that completely nameless and identificationless people will show up in black suits and change things however the government wants them. The Boy in the Box is a real-world case that happened in 1957 in Philadelphia, in which a boy's body was found in a box on the side of the river, and he was never identified. This was weird because no one nearby reported a missing child, no orphanages reporting missing children, nothing. It was just a body found in a box for some reason, which implies murder or foul play, but no one ever knows who did it, and there's never been any connection made. Most theories relate to the idea that it was a cover-up by an orphanage or things such as, but it doesn't change the fact that it's odd that a child could just disappear and no one would notice. Reality simulations is another setup. Basically, the whole Matrix idea that reality itself is either one giant simulation for everyone or certain individuals. Clown sightings are in reference to in 2016, whenever various people showed up in clown costumes with knives and weapons and began threatening people in public. What's interesting about this is ask yourself, do you know of anyone that dressed up as a clown? Or have you heard of anyone dressing up as a clown? And why did it happen in thousands all across the US at once? No one's ever came forward, there were never any public plans made, but yet, all at once, they just showed up and then went away. Weird. Divination is the idea that one can see the future or have premonitions of the future through supernatural means. So essentially through meditation or summoning, someone can figure out what will happen in the future. Space is fake is exactly what it says, space is fake, that either the night sky is a simulation or it is a sort of curtain that's been put up by extraterrestrials in order to give the illusion of space, even though it's not real. Pantheism is a more traditional idea that there is not necessarily a God, but more so that God is a being completely outside the understanding of people, and instead exists all around us everywhere at once, or we are essentially a part of God. It is a very spiritualist idea of the universe. Intelligent design is exactly what it says, that people were made intelligently and with purpose as opposed to a random set of accidents or coincidences, and this is pretty much the basis of every religion, that people were created rather than accidentally. LA oil rigs was interesting, and I had no idea about it until reading this. Apparently in LA, regular oil rigs are not up to code or sightly for the city, so they're hidden in completely normal buildings like this. Every floor you see is fake. All of it is just an exterior covering, and inside is just a working oil rig, and these exist all down the street in LA. Also, this isn't really a theory, it's literally what it is. There are oil rigs working inside of fake buildings in LA. Ghost Girl is also very fake. I think this is just simply referring to the idea of a ghostly girl watching over people when they sleep, or in the corners when they are awake, which I think is something a lot of people can relate to, I hope. Operation Fishbowl was real-world events that happened in 1962, in which the government started launching nukes into the atmosphere and detonating them, essentially to see what happened. It was called Operation Fishbowl because of the shape that the nuclear cloud would take when that high in the atmosphere. Not only did this probably have disastrous consequences on the weather and environment, but the whole thing Oppenheimer was afraid of, that the nuke could light the atmosphere on fire and kill us all, not 20 years later, they were directly firing them at the atmosphere to see what would happen. So, good job, team. Archdemons and archangels is another idea that comes from Christianity. Originally, archangels were the lead warriors or chieftains of the angels, so as they were cast out of heaven, they would become archdemons. So this is just the idea of these very powerful demons and angels existing. The Philosopher's Stone is an idea that was originally put forward by Charlemagne the Great of what is now Holy Roman Empire, that's it. The Philosopher's Stone was the basis of what is known as alchemy, which is essentially converting one element into a different kind of element. This stone was something he wrote about several times in his findings, that when approaching another element could simply turn it into something else. So what ancient societies would know as magic, we would know as extreme radioactive properties or whatever have you with what theory you're following. What's interesting is the Philosopher's Stone, as it's mentioned, has never been found, although there are things similar. So it is, like I said, essentially the bedrock of what is now alchemy. My red is not your red is the once kind of novel but now overknown concept that just because I see a color one way does not mean you see a color one way. We could see completely different colors, but because we've both spent our entire life thinking that something is blue, we both call it blue without knowing we each see different kinds of blues. It's just that concept. Vampires, while at first may be seeming odd, it does make sense in the grander scheme of things that it's on this list. For example, take old world ideologies and think about why they believed in vampires the way they did. Things such as certain people need to be staked through the heart, or tied up, or in some cases flipped upside down in their coffin. What would the reason for that be unless they had seen something that made them think that was necessary? And it leads into this whole idea of maybe our understanding of humans in history isn't what we think it is. Aura is another setup one. It's essentially the idea that humans exude this spiritual energy around them that changes with their mood and things such as. And this goes into gravitational pulls and sonic vibrations of the earth and things such as. Francis Levy's handprint is interesting. I didn't know anything about this until doing the research for this video. In 1924, a man named Francis Levy was a firehouse worker who, while cleaning a window, got ordered to go away on a call. On that call, him along and 7 other crewmen died in a fire. After this whole event was over, someone tried to spray the window of the firehouse, and his handprint would not come off. This got to the point that they used bleach, acid, pressure washers, all of it, and it became a novelty around the town. People would come to see it. The glass company came to try to see if they could figure it out, but for whatever reason, this handprint was perfectly formed onto this window. The ending is kind of ridiculous though. In 1944, a boy who was throwing newspapers through one and broke the window, ending the legacy. But it is odd that this handprint stayed completely unfazed by all of the removal process for 20 years. Bohemian Grove is a 2,700-acre campsite in the western United States, which has been home to several presidents such as Reagan, Nixon, etc. What's weird about Bohemian Grove is the theories that go on around it. For example, there are no pictures taken during certain commencement ceremonies, and people who have claimed to sneak in and take pictures have gotten some weird stuff from it. This all goes back to the idea of secret societies and things that happen, but essentially Bohemian Grove is a gathering place for world elites to do who knows what. Lost Civilizations is simply in reference to the fact there are entire societies that are known about in ancient texts, but that we just can't find. The Mayans, for example, was supposed to have 3 giant cities, and only 2 have been discovered. With our understanding and GPS satellites, it's really weird that these entire civilizations just simply can't be found. The Vikings are another one. Several of the sites that they talk about being set up at or where they live have just never been discovered. This goes into conspiracies of cover-ups or of information being hidden and things such as, but it's an interesting concept that these entire worlds can just disappear. Paranormal beings is also super vague, just supernatural entities that defy the normal realm of logic. Professional sports scripted is exactly what it says. The idea that companies and elites make up what happens in the games, even if the players aren't necessarily aware of it, in order to drive revenue in the right direction, or ticket sales, or blah blah blah, money, money, money. Snuff cinema in itself is not a theory, it's a real thing. It's simply the idea that people will actually take videos of people being murdered or raped or things such as and sell them on the dark web or in shady circles. Where most of the theory comes in is who makes these may be higher up elitist, or at least the buyers might be. So while this is a real world thing, it gets a lot more creepy when you think about who may be consuming it. Gang stalking is a phenomenon that is mostly observed in schizophrenics, but it is the idea that several mundane people are following you at any given time. So what that may mean practically is whenever you walk up to the mailbox, your neighbor looks at you. Whenever you drive to work, a car pulls up beside you and it's kind of going the same speed. And when you get to work, someone keeps glancing at you. The idea of gang stalking is that all these people are in on it and are conspiring against you for some reason. This is also seen a lot in conspiracy theorist circles, with ideas that people who know too much are being followed by essentially men in black in disguise. Experiments on humans, also super vague, but as mentioned before with things such as MK Ultra and experiments that we know happened in World War II, it's kind of a real thing. I guess the theory would be the extent of it or the modern application of it. The sixth extinction is the idea that there have been 5 primary extinctions in history, such as the meteor and the ice age and things like that, and we are currently on the 6th extinction, which would be man and would be a man-made issue that we created ourselves. Pseudosciences relates to old world theories, or mostly old world theories, of things such as the 4 constants in the body being science or spiritualism and things such as, and essentially where it relates to conspiracy theories is saying that there is more credit to it than has been disproved by science, and the discredit of it is simply repression. The Saturn rings theory comes from the idea that the rings of Saturn were created when an asteroid collided into it some time ago, and the particles of that asteroid were simply caught in its gravitational pull and formed Saturn's rings. Where this gets creepy is thinking that Saturn, speaking in space, is not that far from us, so if something could hit it, something could hit us. Polar shift is essentially the idea that over time the Earth's magnetic poles have shifted, and this will inevitably lead to a cataclysmic event of tectonic plates smashing together and earthquakes and storms and what have you. It's essentially an end-of-the-world idea. The Large Hadron Collider is a real thing that exists in, I believe, Germany, but the entire point of it is it works as essentially a giant gun to shoot particles at each other at speeds of light. What's interesting is the last time this was done, it created a new particle called the Higgs boson. What it essentially did was prevent the machine from being used further, and I should also mention before this firing happened, there was a shock wave that ripped through the machine, damaging it and making them take more time to repair it. A physicist theorized that since time works as a 4th dimension, that shooting 2 particles together at such speeds would theoretically create a black hole. But since the way time and waves work, and there's people who can explain this much better than I can, shockwaves ripple backwards through time in order to prevent us from causing an event that would theoretically destroy the future version. This has to do with the idea of time as a 4th dimension, and we just move through it linearly, although it can be manipulated, and yada yada yada. It's really cool stuff, look into it yourself if you like, but that's the idea. Oumuamua is a body of space debris that passed near our sun some years ago and was viewed from the research station of the same name in Hawaii. What was interesting is that analyzing the particles of this, it seemed to be rather homey to us. It contained carbon and things that look like Earth and stuff such as, and was probably launched after a star exploded some however many galaxies away. What's interesting is the idea that if that Earth was destroyed, and also keep in mind, this thing would have been a whole lot bigger than our Earth. If that super Earth was destroyed by its sun exploding, what means the same could have happened to us? The World War II Black Book was a book that was found in Berlin in 1945 that had the name of several British citizens, in fact thousands of them, with their names, addresses, and places of work that were essentially on a hit list, so to speak, if Germany was to win the war. What's weird about this is why the Black Book would still exist at such a point as 1945 when Germany was pushed all the way into Berlin, and the details are that it was found in a sofa somewhere in Berlin, and it couldn't have been the Reichstag because that place was absolutely burned to the ground. So there are several theories about why this book was created, if this book is real, etc., etc. Fish rain is a phenomenon that occurs for seemingly no reason, in which various times throughout history, fish have begun to fall from the sky. Similar things have happened with lakes, etc. The leading theory is that somewhere hundreds of miles away, a tornado happened that either pulled these things out of the water or off of land and threw them that far. But even then, that doesn't necessarily make sense looking at some of the specific instances it's happened. So it's just weird. Figure it out for yourself. Clinton body doubles is exactly what it says. That several times in the public, the Clintons have used body doubles at either politically challenging times or times they were under scrutiny in order to not die. The butterfly effect is a concept that mostly relates to time travel theory and things such as that one very minor change will cause a series of changes to happen afterwards that can affect the course of history. For example, if I was to simply do this video a minute longer and not leave the house, well, that could cause me to end up in a car accident that may kill me or injure me or something rather, which would change the course of history all because of one seemingly meaningless task. This is where you hear the whole, don't go back into the past and flip over a stone, you could change world history. This is just that laid out. Ninjins are a Japanese legend of these giant human-like sort of porpoise-looking creatures that roam in the Pacific Ocean and sing sailors into their death. These are very different from mermaids, not only in their appearance, but the fact they are much, much larger. I believe up to 50 feet in some of the legends descriptions. But what's also interesting is that there are several very similar things to ninjins mentioned in Viking culture and in Indian culture and things such as, which makes it weird considering these tribes have never had contact with each other, so The Patterson-Gimlin massacre is in reference to the Patterson-Gimlin tapes. For those that don't know, it is the very famous video or supposed first sighting of Bigfoot. If you watch the entire tape, at the beginning there seems to be something on the ground that appears as a pool of blood, and the men in the video are washing blood off of their hands. The idea of this being that these people were up there hunting for Bigfoot and simply started taking the video as the last one was leaving or walking around the campground. This leads into the idea among Bigfoot hunters that the reason we don't see them is that they were hunted out by people, and what we're seemingly watching here is the last group near the public eye being massacred. When I mentioned at the beginning, there are things that can get me kicked off of YouTube immediately. This is what I was referring to. So feel free to look it up in your own time. I'm going to be very light with it. The Houdin Plan was an idea imagined by anthropologist Edward Houdin, which essentially said after World War II they needed to do something about the Germans, and the best thing to do was something called the Great Replacement Theory, and I'm going to stop talking there and you can figure it out for yourself. The oil pit squid was discovered in Indiana, in which while cultivating an oil source, there was an 8 to 12 inch squid that popped out, and supposedly this has happened more than once by oil crews in the area. This makes absolutely no sense because the squid shouldn't be able to survive in oil, and why is it in the middle of landlocked Indiana? A lot of the information I found on this related back to the hollow earth idea. Regardless of what your theory is on it, it's very weird that this thing exists at all. And then lastly, I'm going to get into the two most interesting theories that I found on this tier, and I believe that they are interconnected to each other. The first is the people of the mount theory. The background of it essentially works like this. In the 1820s, there was an animal researcher who was trying to figure out why lemurs existed in some parts of the world and not others, and seemingly skip giant areas. This was one of the first groundworks that led to the idea of Pangea, and that all of the continents were originally pushed together. However, even going off of Pangea, that would mean there was a giant portion of land that just doesn't exist anymore, with the idea being whenever the plate shifted, it simply sank below water. The name of this unidentified continent was called Lemuria. Get it? Lemuria. Near the coast of where this supposed Lemuria is supposed to be is an area known as Mount Shasta. Locals have said that at night you can see people leaving in robes, and these people are tall, like much taller than any person can be, 9 to 10 feet. Supposedly beneath Mount Shasta is a completely hollow ground, and that the survivors of this Lemuria sought it for shelter and have lived under there, untouched by society ever since. In 1904, a researcher went to Mount Shasta and said he found miles and miles of underground caves full of gold and silver and crystals and things such as, but whenever he put together a team to go research it, he disappeared, which is weird. Most of what I found on Lemurians and the people of the Mount, again, relates back to Hollow Earth theory, which is why I think that was mentioned so much in this stage, but the idea that there is this untouched race of people existing in underground caves in the modern times. This also relates to something else on this tier, which is crystal skulls. There are 13 perfectly made crystal skulls that have been found variously around the world, but what's odd about them is while they're all made exactly the same, no one can place where they came from. They were each recovered from different dig sites and seem to have the same properties as one another, yet no one really knows where they came from. And every accusation where they came from, such as pre-Columbia or Spain or whatever, has been proved false. According to the legend surrounding these skulls, though, they supposedly contain energy. Anyone who touches the skull or comes into contact with it shares their memories with it, and then that is passed on to the next handler, and so on and so forth. What's interesting about this is part of what the researcher mentioned who got lost in the Mount Shasta cave in 1904 is that they communicated using crystals. When I was reading this for this tier, keep in mind these are two different theories, I thought it was wild that these crystals that Lemurians have to supposedly communicate with each other seem to be the same things that these skulls were that supposedly communicate with each other, and no one knew where the skulls came from, and it related back to Lemuria. Again, to clarify, I don't believe in this, I think it's neat. So to encompass this whole theory together, especially with other stuff seen in the tier, that would mean that the Lemurians did go underground but found either the Agartha beneath Earth, or at least hidden passageways that work all the way under Earth, and there is an entire civilization of humanity existing apart from ourselves underground, and periodically their belongings, such as these crystal skulls, are found in other parts of the world. So there's my huge headcanon for secret underground mole people. Tier 3 is titled as the Truth Agent, and its definition is point of no return. Some of this knowledge will make you appear and act like a lunatic to normal people's eyes, but it's only the beginning. If you are still here, you might want to study and research more following your path. First up is singularity. Singularity has two base definitions. The first is the idea of an infinite zero in an equation. So in things such as a black hole, density is calculated infinitely, which is the reason a black hole exists. However, the version that I think the theory is referring to, because there's more reference to this type of thing in this tier, is the idea that humanity will eventually reach a point of no return with technology, meaning that at some point we will either develop ourselves to such a dependence on technology or to a point that AI will be equal to humanity and there will be no coming back from it. So there are theories that we've already hit that singularity point or that we are very quickly about to, and this relates to ideas on both sides of transhumanism, who think that's a good thing, and people who believe that technology has progressed too far and that we should quit while we're ahead. Quantum suicide and immortality is a tricky one to understand, but I'm going to try to do my best to you. I'm going to need to explain some ideas in quantum mechanics, so bear with me. I am not a physicist, but I will do my best. The word quantum itself refers to super small microscopic particles. I am talking pieces of atoms as they move around. What's interesting about atoms and electrons and things such as is that we never know at one point where they are. They're constantly moving, never setting still. So what that means is that we always predict where they'll be or have an idea of the estimation of where they'll be. Obviously, this is very different from real world logic. I can point at you or a thing at the wall or the Travis Scott vinyl back there and know for sure that it is there, that it is a tangible object. However, you can't do that with atoms. What's interesting is that this doesn't just apply to one atom. It applies to 2 atoms, or 3, or 4, and clusters. So there has to be a point somewhere where atoms quit being atoms that are judged quantumly and begin becoming objects that can be judged logically. This goes back to the whole idea of a sand pile, that if you have a heap of sand and you periodically take 1 grain of sand out, it never quits being a heap. But by that logic, by the time you get down to 1 bit of sand, that's still technically a heap unless there's some rule that changes it somewhere. All this really has to do with thought experiments and theories and things such as. And quantum suicide and immortality itself is one of these thought experiments. If we apply quantum mechanics to real large world creations such as humans or chairs or what have you, that's where we get into ideas like Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat is the idea that if you were to take a cat and to put it in a box, then inside this box there was a mechanism that had a 50% chance of killing the cat. The cat would be both dead and alive until observed. Now remember, this is all applying to quantum mechanics. So if the way atoms work are, we don't know how they are until we look at it at a specific moment and say, oh, that's it, then something larger, like a cat, would have the same rules applied to it. So by Schrodinger's cat logic, or Schrodinger's law, things in the real world are not manipulated until you look at them. But obviously that isn't true because things can happen without us directly looking at it. The inverse to Schrodinger's law is something called Copenhagen's law. Copenhagen's law states that if something happens in our world, then that is the only thing that happens. That there was a series of random events that could occur that led to this specific instance occurring, and that's it. That's all she wrote, that there's only one way it happens. So again, it kind of goes back against Schrodinger's law, but it is a more normal idea for us. Like, that's essentially how things work in the real world. Things happen or they don't. Quantum suicide and immortality is a theory that kind of straddles between the two. It was developed by a man named Hugh Everett, who was, from everything I found, kind of a jerk. For example, his daughter attempted suicide, and he simply glanced up from his notebook and thought nothing of the situation. He was a very calloused man, and this is a very calloused look at reality. It takes the idea of Schrodinger's cat, that there are unknown uncertainties when it comes to how things react in the real world, and we only change it by observation, and applies Copenhagen's law that whatever happens in our world is simply what happened, and that's how the dice fell. Quantum suicide and immortality is very closely related to what we know as string theory, or the idea that there are multiple expanding universes in every direction. It says that every single one of these unknown uncertainties is played out in a different universe. Those familiar with string theory will know what I'm talking about. Every decision that you could make is made in a separate branching off pathway, and this goes on infinitely forever for everyone. Quantum suicide and immortality is applying this to the person, saying that if you are a depressed individual, or if you are a very lively, happy individual, every single change in your character will be played out across these different timelines, which means there are some where you always commit suicide. And this is rather dark, but like I said, he was a callous man. Or there are some where you live forever. His thought process on this being, if you live to be 100 and your heart simply stops, well, there's a branching off universe where your heart goes a second longer, and another one where it goes a second longer, and on and on and on. Which means there are infinite universes where you commit suicide or die forever, and ones where you live on forever in these branching pathways. I really hope that wasn't boring. I thought it was a really cool concept, so yeah. The tree swastika was discovered in Germany in 1992, in which 140 larch trees were planted in the pattern of a swastika. The significance of larch trees is that they share similarities in color and design with the other trees of the area year-round, except for a 3-week window in the winter in which they become brown with their leaves, and as you can see in the picture, create a different pattern when planted between them, in this case a swastika. What's interesting about these trees, given how tall they are, is that they would have to be planted a long time ago. And what's even more interesting is that this isn't the only one. There have been several found across Germany, Poland, France, and things such as, which it's believed during World War II that Nazi sympathizers or Nazi commanders in certain regions would plant these as a show of good faith or loyalty to the fatherland and blah, 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 what have you. It's interesting that these monuments, or natural monuments to an empire since defeated, can still appear randomly in the real world, and it's scary to think of how much deeper ideas like this go than we're publicly aware of. Genocide denials goes to both sides, as there will be public opinion that denies sort of publicly accepted ideas of genocide and things that have happened, and there will also be governments who deny accusations towards them of their involvement in genocide, and so on and so forth. It goes both ways. Rocco's Basilisk is another thought experiment that comes from an online user who went by the name of Rocco. He developed the idea that if AI is to come to a point of singularity, or to where it gets so powerful that it's smarter than us and starts to kill us, it would be beneficial now to help it. Because after this AI becomes so super intelligent, it may begin killing people who weren't part of its creation. While this is already kind of a logical fallacy, the whole idea of you have to do evil to prevent evil from happening to you and blah, 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 what's interesting about it is some of the more hypothetical theories that it gets into, and there's so many I won't go into them, but ideas that this AI may, since it can manipulate time, go back in time and simply stop people from being born who wouldn't help it, so everyone that's alive now is people that would only help it, or that the AI itself has simply come back in time to silently watch and see what people will lead to its creation, and so on and so forth. It's essentially a cautionary tale about AI, and while this is a more submissive answer to it, like, we gotta help it or else, it's used in a lot of circles about the dangers of AI itself. Torrid is a really cool one I remember hearing about several years back, specifically the Man from Torrid, as it's called. The story goes like this. A man entered a Japanese airport and was caught at exchange because his passport was weird. It said that he was from a country called Torrid, and it had his full information, date of birth, all of it was correct except the country of origin. The security pulled him to the side and began asking him questions about this country, to which the man was confused and kept replying that he's simply from Torrid. As a matter of fact, he pointed to it on a map, saying that that map was incorrect because it's supposed to reside between Germany and France. He gave correct accounts of information through history, like World War II and the Soviet Cold War. He gave numbers for them to call, which all proved to be non-existent, and this lasted for some time. That night, the security put him in a hotel so that they could figure out what to do, and the next day when they went to get him, he was gone. There was no evidence of him, there was no information found, and he was never seen again. A lot of this relates back to the Mandela effect that I mentioned in the first here. There are these parallel universes that keep interacting with one another, but it's interesting, the idea that there is a different, slightly different world from ours. It still had events like Cold War and World War II, but resulted in the creation of a new country called Torrid. The bloop is something that personally affects me because it has to do with my worst fear ever, the ocean. In the early 2000s, ocean researchers had several microphones placed across the Pacific Ocean, the purpose of it to be to monitor blue whale migrations. That was until, out of nowhere, from a location that was triangulated to be the bottom of the ocean, there was a bellowing roar that was so loud, it was picked up by microphones in a 3,000-mile radius direction. To put that in perspective, the vocal cords of whatever this thing would had to be 3 times the size, at least, of a blue whale. To this day, no one knows where it came from, and it has been the subject of several conspiracies or monster theories about things that live beneath the ocean, which is just further confirmation to me that I don't belong in the ocean. Rosicrucianism is closely related to an old religion that was a branch off of Christianity some 800 years ago, known as Gnosticism, or Gnosticism, not sure how to pronounce it. It essentially follows the idea that God and the Trinity is real for Christianity, but that there are lesser gods, and each of them are mandated to do different things. More specifically, the idea that the lesser god that created Earth is evil and mischievous, and that's why there's so much sin and misery on our Earth. While good things come from Christ and the Godhead, bad things come from our smaller god. Rosicrucianism, from everything that I can find, believes this theory but applies more science into it. Where this applies is that almost everything I found about Rosicrucianism applies to the Masons. The idea being that several of the founders of the Freemasons subscribe to this ideology, and were not only that, but were sort of high priests in this order. So the idea of deidal Christianity mixed with phenomenal science creating the Freemasons stays in line with most of the theories that apply to them. Sinkholes are exactly what it's referring to. Sinkholes, for those that don't know, periodically, especially in man-made areas, giant holes in the ground can open up, and I mean huge. It doesn't just have to be wherever man-made items are, but that's normally where it happens. A lot of the theories around this go back to the idea of gods and stuff, that we have overpopulated the earth too much, and so it's cleansing itself, or back to harmonic vibrations on the earth, and make your own calculations from it. But that's just what the theory is referring to. The Publius Enigma dates back to Pink Floyd's 1994 album, The Division Bell. Someone by the name of Publius appeared online and began saying that there was a secret message hidden in the album, The Division Bell, and anyone that figured it out would be given great reward. Now, while you could just chalk this up to some crazy person on boards, they seem to know a whole lot about Pink Floyd and the album itself, and when questioned about their legitimacy, they said to watch the stage at the next Pink Floyd concert, to which the lights began flashing in code the name of Publius. So obviously this guy has connection somewhere. Despite this, there has never been any huge secret, at least from what I can find, derived from the Division Bell album, and most people believe it to be some huge sort of like paparazzi show from the agents who put together the album, but everyone exclusively denies this. So who is Publius and what's the secret of the Division Bell? Russian sleep experiments are a supposed experiment that was uncovered that happened in Russia during World War II. And while you may be familiar with the famous creepypasta that I was before looking into it, the creepypasta comes off of the supposed real-world documentation. The idea of this experiment was to develop a drug that would give soldiers the ability to stay awake for days at a time without side effects or crashing. However, according to the legend, what happened during these experiments is that as the days progressed, the test subjects became more and more insane to the point that they completely lost touch with humanity and became these groveling monsters that asked for pain and wanted to hurt each other, and they ripped someone's throat out, and yada 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 goes on and on. There are logs of this, which you can look up and read yourself, of supposedly what happened. There's a lot of gore and violence involved, but it all relates back to the idea that whenever we sleep, we stave off this inner demon that we all have inside of us. And without sleep for weeks at a time, we allow it to become more powerful till eventually it takes over. It all relates to the overarching concept of the evil within every human. Esoteric knowledge is kind of broad. From everything that I've found, it has to do with human intentions. So esoteric knowledge would be a true understanding of what it is in your brain that makes you do the things you do or behave the way that you are. Esotericism is mentioned a lot in things like Gnosticism or Rosicrucianism and other old religions that are kind of the development for a lot of conspiracies. The Denver airport is an interesting one, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. For one, the layout of the Denver airport makes absolutely no sense. The way it's built with its hallways that go seemingly nowhere and terminals that are completely separate from everything else doesn't make a lot of sense on the outside. However, when you look at old plans that had the idea of there being a giant underground, and there supposedly isn't one, it comes to the theory that it is a secret bunker, either by the military or some say the Illuminati and things such as. But the theory just doesn't stop there. For one, there are some really weird art pieces around the Denver airport. For example, there is a painting of a German Nazi in a gas mask with rainbows coming out of him and a giant scythe, as well as a statue outside of a 32-foot tall horse that is blue with red glowing eyes that people refer to as Blucifer, which during its construction, the head fell off, killing the creator, to which they put the head back on and left it. And on top of that, there are signs all over the Denver airport that says it was created by the Freemasons and it's a Mason establishment and blah, blah, blah. And theories range from the idea of Denver airport being the gateway to hell to just the idea that it's a secret military or Freemason base that is kept quiet from the public. Archons relate back to Gnosticism, which I mentioned earlier. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Essentially, if the lesser god created our world, the Archons are his helpers or tormentors. And it goes to the idea that mischievous or evil things that happen in the real world are the deliberate actions of these tiny demons. I say tiny demons, essentially it's just demons working for a different entity than the devil. So you could be safe to say these are the demons of Gnosticism. Spirit science is exactly what it says. The idea that scientific concepts can be related to spiritualism and things like auras and chakras and things such as, and that through application of spirit science you can unlock or understand your inner self. The plane of jars is interesting. In Laos there are these fields that are all grouped together that hold anywhere between 1 to 400 of these giant 9-foot wide stone jars. They've all been carved out from stone, most of them have lids with them, and they're just sitting in these fields and no one knows where they came from. The locals in the area talk of legends and say that giants used to roam this land. And there's again giants being mentioned from the past years. And that what they would do is they would carve out these stones and set them in these fields, and that's where they'd keep their alcohol and honey and things such as, and each field was a different keeping place for a different material. Sadly, not a lot of research or insight can be done to this place, because during Vietnam, the United States dropped more explosives on specifically the field of jars than the entirety of World War II. And that combined with all of the undetonated explosives there mean research is very, very scant and dangerous to do. So I guess we may not know more about this, but I like the Giants idea. It's cool. The Beacon of Hate was discovered on June the 2nd of 2000, in which a man in the western United States began picking up on this radio transmission that was being broadcast locally, and after enhancing it, he found a looping broadcast in which someone was screaming over and over about America selling themselves to camels, and pornography and religion should die, and the end times is coming with a chariot, and other mixes of like revelations type speak and general disdain for the United States, so on and so forth. This was looping for, as far as he could tell, about 8 months before it disappeared. To this day, the FCC has better things to do. There have been no information found on it, no one knows who caused it or what happened, and it simply remains a mystery. Feral children is a real-world phenomenon which is quite sad, in which kids who either ran away or were abducted at a young age and lived away from human contact simply became feral. This is observed a lot whenever researchers go to lesser populated areas such as forest and jungles, in which children have been allowed to get away from their families and been raised in the wilderness. Normally the child is very either scared of human interaction or violent around humans and resolves to things such as running on all fours, but it can also result in some very interesting side effects such as different formed bone structure and nasal pathways that are simply just, evidence of adaptation in humans. It's interesting, however, that when taking away from other human contact in these sort of case studies, that we become animalistic. Antinatalism is a more recent ideology. Natalism is the idea that having children is good and, having a baby is good, whereas antinatalism is the opposite of that and says that having a child is morally bad. The idea with this theory being that if the higher-ups or Illuminati or whatever have you is trying to dissolve the family unit, then this idea of antinatalism will be put out more and more across the human populace until eventually families or having children or things such as is seen as a natural bad. Charles Fort is someone that I wish that I knew about before getting into this because he seems like an interesting individual. He wrote several fiction books which had to do with different occurring phenomena, such as teleportation, human combustion, ball lightning, etc. What's more interesting is ideas such as teleportation and ball lightning he's actually credited with inventing. What goes furthermore is in that most interviews where he talked about these phenomena, he simply said that in studying real-world phenomena, they are things that he observed. The idea with this being that because of Charles Fort's writings, we have highlights to some things that really do happen, such as human combustion, teleportation randomly, ball lightning, so on and so forth, to the point that a term given to real-world supernatural events is Fortean, such as giant unexplainable monsters can be called Lovecraftian. Also, everything else I found on Charles Fort generally relates back to the occult, with several sort of scientific occult circles claiming him as one of their founders. The Road to Ruta was a comic book put out by the federal government for school children in the 1980s. The point of this book was to teach children concepts such as scarcity and market value and things such as. However, a man by the name of Max Weir later came out with his own theory regarding the comic. His idea is that large governments are getting tired of banking circles owning the world through their amounts of money they loan out and things such as, and it all has to get back to Wall Street and national banking circles and blah blah blah. But his idea is the comic is showing a federal idea to get back to a new gold standard, or the idea that after a great reset, so to speak, which is being talked about a lot now in the news, that we could reverse our current banking circle idea and return to a second gold standard, as he calls it. Mereological nihilism is another one of those thought concepts. It's the idea that there are no things that are composed of other things. They are simply the smaller things made into bigger things. What I mean by that is there's no such thing as a chair. There are pieces of wood in straight lines that are pointed together in chair fashion. While this whole thing seems kind of pointless in that regard, as you apply that more and more to people and biology and things such as, it becomes more of an idea of this sort of nihilism when it comes to science and humanity. The Cagots were interesting considering I had literally never heard about this until starting a review for this. The Cagots were a race of people in 16th and 17th century France who were horribly discriminated against. And by horribly, I mean that whenever entering the town, they had to ring a bell like a leper to let other people know they're around. Not only that, but they had to walk with shoes on at all times or be arrested, so that way their skin didn't touch the ground that other barefoot people had to walk on. They were not allowed to farm. One Cagot who tried to, on his own land, had stakes run through his feet, and they had to use a specific font when writing, that way people would know a Cagot wrote it. If they didn't, as happened to one man, he had his hand cut off and pinned to the church door. And there were several rumors that spread up about them, like because they wore shoes all the time, people said that they had webbed feet, or because they only wrote in one font, children would say that that's because they have the devil's handwriting. What's really weird is no one knows where they came from. They seemingly look like any other French person. The ideas were they came from a defeated army during the Goth period way back, but that can't be confirmed. Ideas are that they are people from north of the English Channel who came south and were simply shamed against, but that can't be confirmed. So seemingly this race just pops up in France, is horribly hated, and then disappears. It wasn't until the French Revolution, in which several Cagots went to record offices and burned any information that they were Cagots and simply assimilated back into French society. Deep Sea Lab text relates to real experiments that happened called Sea Lab, which were carried out by the United States Navy. The idea was to place these science capsules in different spots around the ocean for researchers to live in and do research from. The first two went off without a hitch. However, the third one, during its setup, someone went down to fix a carbon monoxide poisoning problem and died in the process, so the Navy shut the entire thing down. The theory is that these experiments are still being carried out in secret for whatever reason, and the idea that it was kept out of public eye, not because someone died, but because they wanted to start research on something the public shouldn't be aware of. However, I think the biggest travesty that come from that is that the people who went down into these bases were called aquanauts, and we need to bring that back. Hitler escaped inside the Earth. He is relating back to what I've talked about in previous tiers known as Agartha. The idea being that the Nazis at the Space 221 were supposedly looking for Agartha, which keep in mind would be the entire Earth's inside, found it, made tunnels that led up to Berlin in Germany, and whenever Germany began losing the war, Hitler simply went underground into this underworld. So if you were to get to the secret plane of Agartha, it would theoretically be Nazis and giants. So do with that information what you will. Illuminati blood banks is exactly what it says. There are real-world programs where the rich can buy the blood of the young in order to get transfusions for it to ideally make them younger. And there are things like blood facials that people do, and we are living in a dystopia. However, Illuminati Blood Banks just says that this secret Illuminati organization has near infinite supplies for these for their members, so that they can always harvest the blood of the young to stay fit, which I hate to admit is one of the least outlandish on this entire list. Sacred geometry is that the idea that there are certain shapes and patterns in geometry that relate to the construction of the real world, so much so that God himself would be the geometric shape of life itself. And it gets into this whole idea that certain shapes can be used to summon different things, and so on and so forth. The Black Pope prophecy comes from a supposed prediction that popped up in the 1500s, specifically 1590, that was 112 phrases to describe every pope in existence. Not only everyone that came before, that everyone that was coming afterwards. Whoever made this is often switched around with people saying it being different saints or bishops in the church. This eventually leads to a final pope, which it says will bring the fall of Rome. However, this one, from everything I found, is pretty fake. Like, it had all of them right up until 1590 when it was written, and then after that, none of them made any sense applied to different popes or whatever. DMT beans is the fact that while on DMT, several different individuals have these shared hallucinations of something called clockwork elves, which appear as these tall, silvery, slender creatures that watch over them while they're high. Not only that, but there are several shared hallucinations involving syntax and life and blah blah blah. Don't do drugs. The Missing Children Forest refers to a 700,000 acre forest in LA County, Los Angeles, in which children have gone missing with no evidence found afterwards. Originally, there was about 8 kids that went missing and was later pinned on a serial killer in the area, but since then he's been in jail and people have still gone missing in this forest, to the point that dozens of kids simply walk into the woods and never return. This can lead to tons of speculation, but it all traces back to the idea of what in these woods is drawing kids in and what's making them not be found. Solipsism is the concept that nothing outside of your own mind can be known. For example, we could all be in the Matrix right now and everything we see be fake. We could be in alternate realities and everything that we see is an illusion, blah blah blah, but the only thing you can know for sure is your mind. The fact that you are having thoughts right now and that you created these thoughts is the only thing that can be known for sure. And it is the base theory for the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Thule is a concept that has been traced back to the early Greeks, in the idea that on all their maps they had this region located far to the north known as Thule, in which they said that's where sea monsters came from, that's where these giants came from, etc., etc. There's different theories about, well, maybe it was Ireland or maybe it was Norway and whatever have you, but what's interesting is it's never been exactly laid down, and while all of the Greeks had sort of this unified idea of what Thule was and what was there, we can't find anything that exactly matches it in our modern text. So maybe it's something that sank below ground in a plate shift, or maybe it's something that never existed. Who knows? Der Glocke is German for the bell and refers to secret Nazi superweapon research that occurred in World War II. Theories for this include things such as the Wunderwaffe or the Schrönergewehr, which is German for wonder weapon or sun rifle. The ideas for this being that the Germans were looking ways to concentrate radiation into these centralized waves as a form of attack, or electricity itself in these sort of like long-range tasers. Not only that, but there were records of them looking into teleportation and how to move people instantly over large distances. They were looking for these giant air plug cannons that would fire a piece of air large enough to take out planes, and it goes on. But this whole Die Glocke just relates to the idea that these Germans had working models for these things, and that the reason they've been kept so secretive is because after the Allies won the war, they wanted to use that research themselves. Arnold's real height is in reference to the actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this bizarre situation in which people don't know his real height, and even he has not said what his height is, so it comes down to people comparing him next to other known actors' height in movies, and people guess anywhere between 5'10" to 6'2". I have no idea why this was in tier 3 since it's the only one that doesn't fit, but yeah, a great way to start off part 2. Natural park closures is in reference to the fact that several national parks around the US will periodically close for unknown reasons. This can range anything from cleanup time to certain year time events when supposedly workers are off, yet it doesn't make sense since national parks aren't exactly something that needs mediated, leaving people to believe supernatural occurrences or things like I spoke of in my stairs video and so on and so forth, that there are these secretive phenomena that occur throughout U.S. national parks that the managers of them want to keep the public quiet of. Lake Baikal is referencing Lake Baikal in Russia and is the deepest lake in the world. At 5,387 feet, it's host to several mysteries, including that of aliens and sea monsters and things such as. When the lake was first discovered, several runes and etchings were found that depicted giant fish people walking in and out of the water and these giant serpents moving beneath the waves. It goes further than that though. Declassified Russian documents show that researchers who went underwater to look for missing people came across these humanoid-looking creatures in silver suits, and whenever they approached these creatures, 3 people on the crew were instantly killed and 4 others injured. Several lights have been seen both beneath the waves and above them and in the sky around, and people even report mirages of castles and old buildings on the shore that disappear with the blink of an eye. The dancing plague was a real-world phenomenon that occurred in 1518 in France. For whatever reason, a few people in the middle of the town began dancing. A few more that began watching began dancing as well, and this went on and on for 2 months. During this time, about 400 people became involved, with roughly 24 dying of exhaustion. The story goes that the people who were dancing were crying, trying to get people to help them stop. Local shopkeepers were bringing food out to feed the people as they were dancing since they couldn't quit. And to this day, it's just chalked up as mass hysteria. No one knows why the dancing plague happened or where it came from, and it just remains a weird story. Panspermia is a belief that life does exist in the universe through microorganisms. In other words, asteroids that pass by Earth or other places that maybe host microorganisms carry them through the stars, and that's where other life species can come from and things such as. It's pretty much just the idea that life exists everywhere around us even if we don't see it. The WebDriver Torso is a bizarre YouTube channel that popped up in 2013. Since then, all the way into 2018, they upload these random videos that are just a red square and a blue block in different directions as beeping noises is played in the background. There are a total of 624,774 of these videos. And while Google has come out and said that it's merely just something to test the YouTube algorithm, the beeping is definitely odd, meaning leading many people to believe it's a sort of numbers broadcast or something else creepy shadow man. Toxoplasmosis is a real-world disease in which the parasite Toxoplasmodia enters the human body. While in the body of a healthy person, Toxoplasmodia does nothing. If someone is pregnant, it can cause severe damage to the baby. Other than that, it's not really a big deal, and the parasite is most often transferred through cats. However, where the theory comes from is that studies have appeared showing that toxoplasmosis can cause neuroticism in the host. Now, while you may not think this is a big deal to people associated with parasites, keep in mind there are about 3 million confirmed cases of toxoplasmosis in the US every year. The theory with this being that the parasite has drastically influenced not only American culture, but world culture for years due to influence of the psychology of its host, which again is a lot. Introspection rundown is a practice employed by Scientology in order to treat mental breakdowns. This has gone so much so to the point of saying that it is a replacement for psychology itself. While the church is very hush-hush about what happens during these procedures, it did come under scrutiny whenever someone died during one of them. Lisa McPherson was a woman who was a member of the Church of Scientology, and after suffering a mental breakdown in a car accident, members of the church came, took her from a hospital saying that she didn't believe in medical treatment, and brought her to a discreet location. Her body was found weeks later severely dehydrated and malnourished. Not only that, but she had hundreds of insect bites on her, which the coroner later believed to be that of a cockroach. So that creates many questions about this scenario. Did the cockroach bites happen before or after she died? And if they happened before she died, then what the heck is this introspection process that Scientology uses? The United States are an experiment relates to the idea of the Great Experiment, or the overarching idea that the United States was created in order to prove to the world if democracy could work. Where it gets into more of the conspiracy side is what powers wanted this experiment to happen, be it the Freemasons or the Illuminati or some other creepy historical shadow organization. Belfield psyops I couldn't find anything on. I believe this is referring to the Belfield conspiracy, which is sort of an old joke. Belfield is a small town in Germany, and the joke goes like this. Have you ever been to Byfield? Do you know anyone from Byfield? Do you know anyone who's ever been to Byfield? Well, then Byfield simply doesn't exist. It's sort of a parody of the whole idea of crazy conspiracies that just say these blatantly giant things don't exist. Like, for example, in searching for this, I came across the theory that Finland doesn't exist, and that kind of got the point across. Online video game monitoring is exactly what it says, that the government and other agencies is watching online multiplayer games in order to monitor what people are saying and doing, which, considering the announcement Sony just made, is not far from the truth. John Babacone Lee was a man arrested for murder in 1885 and sentenced to hang. In researching this, it seems like he didn't do it, or if he did do it, the evidence was circumstantial at best, since all the evidence I could find was that he was a guy who lived near the woman who was murdered and had a cut on his arm, which meant she may have possibly that when he was taken to execution, he was attempted to be hanged 3 times, all 3 times of which it didn't work. What happened is the trapdoor was tested out as he stood there. He then went and stood on it, to which the trapdoor was pulled but wouldn't open. He stepped off, the trapdoor was tested again, to which it opened fine, and this process repeated 3 times, which after finally the medical expert said that he wasn't going to be a part of it because God didn't want this man to hang, and instead John was just given life in prison. It's an interesting story, especially since there were witnesses and this happened 3 times in a row. It leads to the idea that perhaps divine intervention didn't want John to die. RPG Insanity Training was a wild read. When I finally found information on it, it's the idea that Yakuza is paying off Nintendo and other game companies such as in order to promote insane behavior in their audience to promote further anarchy and disruption within communities and the world. So, yeah. Don't play Animal Crossing. The Oz factor is the idea that, much like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, during certain points, people can leave this plane of existence. For example, if you disassociate too hard, you can cross over to another nearby parallel universe, or at least a universe between universes. All the examples that I found in this were such as whenever you enter a building where it seems like none of the workers are there who should be there, or if you're ever walking down the street and interactions seem incredibly odd for a small amount of time, this could be signs that you are in a sort of space between spaces. Now I'll be honest here. Some of these titles are so vague, I could find nothing for them exactly. Like, there's so much stuff it could possibly mean that I'm simply going to have to take a guess, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm sorry about that, but I have no idea. So extreme continents, from everything I can figure out, either has to do with lost continents or the end points of known continents. These two actually kind of go hand in hand with each other. I found several theories that during tectonic plate shifts, lost continents, which are land masses that sunk below the ocean, I spoke of Lemuria in Tier 2, I believe, that whenever they meet the land and the land begins to slope off, this sort of area between continents is where civilizations used to exist. And that's the best I could do for this. Sorry if that is totally off the mark, but I promise I tried. Shaver's writings refers to the comics written by a man named Richard Shaver. His theory was that thousands of years ago, aliens came to Earth and, after leaving offspring to populate the planet, flew back out to their home planet and left their children, or as he called them, Deros, here on Earth. His explanation fell in line with what I've mentioned before, the hollow earth theory, or that of Agartha, and that these children live in underground caves, and people who periodically go missing for whatever reason are being used as either food or just a torture source for these underground creatures. Kind of falls in line with the idea that this is not our home and it's someone else's, and at any moment we could essentially be wiped out. So only good thoughts on this channel. Porn control. Can I say porn? Whatever. Porn control is the idea that porn is used by mass media or global elites in order to make the populace submissive and compliant. The idea with this being people who watch porn have decreased sex drive for other people, which makes them less outgoing and less assertive in situations, and generally makes a weaker populace, and therefore porn is used as a manner to disable the population for whatever these higher powers want. A temporary autonomous zone is more of a belief, especially one imposed by anarchists throughout history, with the idea that throughout periods of time, whenever government is infringing on culture too much, areas should crop up, or temporary autonomous zones as they're called, in which information could be exchanged freely and thoughts and ideas between people, and then they could disseminate and leave the autonomous zone, and these ideas could continue to proliferate. So from everything I read, essentially think of it as underground churches or secret book readings during book burning times throughout history, and things such as basically the whole idea that if a government is encroaching on culture or ideas too much, that people should come together and exchange them in secret. Henotheism is when someone believes in many gods, yet only worships one god. This is something that is commonly seen in old world history, where often people would believe in the hierarchy of gods in old legends, yet they would normally only go to churches or worship a specific one. This is just sort of the name to describe that. Quantum jumping is an idea in spiritual psychology and very closely relates to spiritual science. It is the idea that in times of stress, someone can quantum jump to another version of themselves in a parallel universe in order to gain insight or information. This has a lot to do with self-enlightenment, and if you wanted to think of it as anything, kind of think of it as the Oz factor I mentioned earlier, only done on purpose in order to learn something. Fulcanelli is interesting because no one knows the identity of this man, and the only reason we know he exists is through his journals and students who say they learned under him. Fulcanelli was a French alchemist. This relates back to the Philosopher's Stone that I mentioned earlier, but he wasn't just an alchemist, he was the best. So much so that his students say they would routinely see him turn 100 grams of iron into gold and things such as. Considering that he would have operated in, I believe, the 1500s, any practices that he would have been doing would be far ahead of his time, yet again, we don't know his identity. This leads theories for everything that he was an alien or the devil, so figure out somewhere in the middle what you want him to be. Fringe Viper releases is exactly what it sounds like. Several deadly viper species popped up in France within the last 20 to 30 years, with the idea being that secret organizations or the French government themselves are purposefully doing it either to keep people out of the woods or control the populations of various species of animal. Although the latter doesn't make that much sense, because if you wanted to do that, why make them venomous? Grey goo is another concept that has to do with singularity that again I mentioned in tier 2, or ideas of technology taking over. It essentially gets to the idea that nanotech will commit something called ecophagy, which translates to literally eating the habitat. The idea being that at some point a nanotech will be developed that only knows to reproduce itself over and over again, and if it sees humanity as a threat to this initiative, it will simply eat everything, and I mean everything. Habitat, landmass, biomass, all of it, and create a gray goo across the planet of itself. It's one of those cataclysmic events in which we could wipe ourselves out, which is talked about several times before and will be mentioned several times again. Mach's principle is an idea in theoretical physics and makes us ask the question of why some things are held in orbit while other things are pushed away. The description or example that's most common is this. If you were to stand in a field and look directly up at the stars and hold your arms out to your side and spin around, then why do the stars stay in orbit as you spin while your arms are being pulled out from you? And essentially comes back to the idea that while in motion, things near you are pushed away and things away from you are kept in a relative position. It's a weird idea that has to do with, again, theoretical physics, but that's basically the principle of it, and it's used to explain a lot of natural phenomena. Volcani, I have no idea how to pronounce that, is a series of forests that occur in the Latvian area of Europe, in which these giant stones are assembled into these piles, and no one knows why. Theories have originally ranged that maybe a castle was going to be built there and just hadn't, but there's no record of that throughout history. To giants putting the stones there, there's giants again. What's even weirder is that it seems these stones periodically move. Never enough to be widely noticed or able to be pointed at by everyone, but just enough to keep the local park people suspicious that they're being moved. And keep in mind, these are really big rocks. It's not like some kid could just come throw them into another pile if they wanted. It would take some deliberate force of nature. This has led to people around the area considering it a spiritual site, and it is a very popular destination for yogis and witches and things such as. Deep ecology fascism is the combination of two different ideologies. Deep ecology is the idea that nature should not only be preserved, but that nature itself is alive and should be treated as such, while fascism is, for this purpose, the idea of preserving original ideas and circumstances for future generations. So if you were to combine the two, it would be the idea of preserving nature to such a ridiculous degree as if nature itself was alive, which would essentially treat any crime against nature as a crime against man. Deathworm relates to that of the Mongolian deathworm, in which the desert of Mongolia, the locals have legends of a giant serpent or worm that lives beneath the sand, and that people who are caught out there by themselves are swallowed up by it. This is backed up by reports in the area of people going missing with no body being found in the desert, and these odd trails being left in the sand for seemingly no reason. I don't even know if I can talk about this one either. It's exactly what it looks like, the joke off of Family Guy, and says that the government developed one in the 80s, and I'm not kidding. KKK funded by governments is exactly what it sounds like. The idea that the government has funded the Ku Klux Klan in order to keep down minorities throughout history, and not just our government, but that England had backing in it too. So yeah. The Titanic didn't sink actually has more plausible information behind it than any other conspiracy in this tier. The company that owned the Titanic, White Star Line, which keep in mind one of the partial owners was JP Morgan, had another ship in their fleet called the Olympia. Most people have it in their mind that the Titanic was way larger than any other ship at its time, but that's not necessarily true. For example, the Olympia, which was another ship owned by the same company, was very similar in size and appearance. A few months before the Titanic set sail, the Olympia had an accident that damaged it seriously and supposedly was going to cost a lot of money to repair. The story is that the Olympia was replaced for the Titanic and simply names were changed between the two ships, and the Olympia was actually sunk as a whole insurance fraud move in order for these stockholders to get a return on their investment. There's a lot of sort of evidence that goes into this. For example, pictures of the Titanic as it's leaving seem to resemble the Olympia more than the Titanic itself. There are records of crewmen who were supposed to be hush-hush about it, calling the Olympia the Titanic in private, and even more so, the Californian, which was another ship in the vessel, the night the Titanic sunk, went to about the same spot, hung out for a few hours, and then left, implying that they were setting up something. It's very odd, and there's a whole lot of information about this, so I encourage you to check it out yourself. Smithsonian suppression refers to the recently discovered event in which around 1900 the Smithsonian smashed thousands of giant human skulls in order to maintain the theory of evolution the way science saw it at the time. This doesn't just stop at skulls though. They destroyed other bones such as femurs that were 4 feet long because it didn't match the current theories of the time. I guess that's the way science worked back then. If it didn't support your theory, just destroy it. These skulls were found across North America, and not only would it have answered questions about immigration to North America before, the coming of Europe and whatnot, it would also have been an opportunity to study these giant humanoid creatures. But we can't, because someone in the 1900s from the Smithsonian didn't like that it didn't match their science project. So yeah, do with that information what you will. Tier 4's title is A Depth of Secrets, and it reads, Occult learnings and mysteries of lower tier that apparently seem to be innocent start to become more sinister. You begin to see patterns everywhere, realizing you only dip your toes in the conspiracy world. Very few people believe or have heard of stuff from this level. First up, we have the Dzopa tribe and the related Dropa stones. This one was really interesting. In 1938, a Chinese research team went to the Himalayan mountains in search of some ore deposit that had been picked up by geographers. Once the team got there, however, they found 716 graves hidden in the back of these tunnel systems that ran through the Himalayan mountains. What's even weirder was inside of each of these graves was a 4-foot tall human skeleton with an abnormally large sized skull. The tombs were filled with ciphers and hieroglyphics that didn't make sense, but located on each one of the grave was a circular disc that have since been termed the Dropa stones. Each of these discs are estimated to be 12,000 years old and contain minerals such as cobalt, which is very rare and normally only found on meteorites, at least in the Himalayan mountains. Years later, research from a Russian university determined that the hieroglyphics on the Dropa stones read out prime numbers. Since this experience, the Chinese government has censored all information regarding it and made that section of the Himalayas a no-travel zone. So yeah, starting off with a good one. Lord Packel's time machine relates to the Mayan king Lord Packel. When researchers found his coffin, they noticed the odd inscriptions on the lid of the coffin that showed him laying inside of what seemed to be some sort of machinery interacting with this very diverse device for whatever reason. What's especially odd is the related Mayan transcriptions in the area spoke that Lord Packel had the ability to control the turning of the sun and things such as. What's even weirder is upon further inspection of the body in the coffin, it is estimated to be that of a 30 to 40-year-old man. Lord Packel was king of this Mayan area for 80 years. So either someone else is buried in Lord Packel's grave, or that inscription of him controlling a machine and turning back the moon and the stars may have some worth to it. Monsanto is essentially your stereotypical evil conglomerate company. They have been known to sue farmers for using natural pesticides in growing supplements. They have been known to fund government campaigns in which the elected politician plans to cut back on restrictions regarding the environment, and have even gone as far to cover up cancer research on their specific products when it's been known to, cause cancer. Of course, as you could imagine, Monsanto is at the center of a lot of conspiracies regarding big pharma, and evil tech and things such as. Vimanas are interesting, and one of the weirdest parts, I think, whenever you look into this whole ancient alien idea. In old Hindu and Sanskrit text, there are these records of these giant flying palaces, and they're not mentioned in any supernatural or strange sense. There's simply depictions and writings of these giant floating palaces that would exist above the Himalayan mountains. It's so odd to me whenever you look at stuff like this, how old world countries would simply just be like, oh yeah, flying houses, those are a thing. North Korea utopia is exactly what it says. It's the idea that North Korea is actually a secretive, perfect world, but that Western media and European media simply discredit it as order to discredit communism and lift up capitalism. That's at least the main version. The other version is a bit more interesting, I think. It's the idea that beneath North Korea is a perfect utopia, but in order to seem unassuming to the world around them, periodically different citizens are sent to live on the surface for years at a time in order to maintain a low-key look, while they live in perfection and disease-free beneath. However, the first version is usually the most popular, as it's simply saying that our governments are censoring information as to not give us an idea that other systems of government could work better. L'Enfant, also known as Pierre L'Enfant, was the chief architect who designed the streets for Washington, D.C. In his notes, he said he used the celestial bodies in order to map out the routes for DC. That's why DC has very odd street planning when it comes to diagonal cuts and things such as. But as other people have pointed out, these streets also line up in satanic shapes, such as several pentagrams or old world geographic shapes being formed by DC streets. This all relates back to the idea that he was funded by the Freemasons and that the original leaders of the United States knew what he was up to, and it's all Illuminati, Satan, government, yeah. The grand unified conspiracy theory is rather diverse depending on who you ask. Normally it looks something like this, and it's just the idea that reptilians and big pharma and Illuminati and Satanism and all that interconnect with each other, and it is all one conspiracy theory that we just look at certain aspects of. Cyber squatting time travelers is pretty funny. For those that don't know, cyber squatting is the practice of buying URLs or usernames on websites that you know are the names of famous people or companies in the hopes that they will one day buy that domain off of you. So the time traveler aspect is hilarious. The only evidence I could find with any of this was supposedly odd names that wouldn't have made a lot of sense, but I mean, you could just chalk that up to people hoping to get lucky. Comic-Con child recruitment's pretty sad. Just the fact that there are children every year during Comic-Con who go missing, the idea of which being they're abducted by human trafficking rings. However, the conspiracy goes a level deeper and says that Comic-Con knows of this behavior, but they are paid off in order to turn a blind eye or to not better tighten security to prevent this type of thing. Plastic surgery runaways was just vague enough that it was hard to find any information on. I believe this is referring to the fact that there are plastic surgeons who will famously perform surgery on either runaways or people who have been kidnapped. This wraps back into human trafficking, but it adds an extra layer to it by implying that medical professionals, or at least some, are in on the whole scheme. Lifetide is a book written by Lyle Watson. A lot of the complex in it are pretty intense. From what little brief reading I did on it, it seems to be the idea that humans are artificial or can at least summon an artificial self through their thoughts, and it all has to do with introspection and the idea of looking inwards to bring out the better self. So a lot of sort of Eastern philosophy, yogi type ideas. Baltic Sea anomaly refers to an event that happened in 2011 in which a fishing ship that was using sonar caught this image while looking at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is, as you could imagine, pretty deep, and the idea behind this being that it is a UFO that crashed on the planet some time ago. It's still there to this day. However, for anyone who knows anything about sea travel, it is much, much harder to keep someone alive underwater than it is in space. This is due to things like pressure, and the deeper you go into water, the harder it is to maintain, which is the reason we normally just send submersibles really deep, and it costs a lot of money. So no one's seen it fit to investigate this yet, or that's what they want you to think. But either way, as far as this moment goes, all we know about is there's this odd shape down there. Planned extinction is just referring to the fact of an idea that was mentioned in previous tiers, that humanity will eventually become extinct, and how this might even be a good thing in order to save the planet. That's the entire idea of eco-triage, that we have to cut off the bleeding somewhere, the bleeding being us, in order to save our ecosystem. Haunted locations world map. From everything I can find, there are several maps that display different haunted locations in the world, so perhaps looking into each of them and researching. If that's what this does means, this could literally go on forever, but I think it's just referring to the fact that there are documented records of haunted places around the world, and that should be at least a little bit concerning. Artificial poisonous snow is something that occurs in mostly Midwest cities from everything I could find, in which snow will occasionally fall from the sky and not melt for a very extended amount of time, and whenever flames is held to it, it becomes black. The implication in this being that the government or some other force is raining this artificial snow on us to poison us in some way. However, in the extra research I did on this, I think this is just pollution. King Babylon's world control is kind of vague because there is no King Babylon. Babylon was an empire. There are kings like Nebuchadnezzar II and Hammurabi, and each have their own conspiracy theories. If I had to guess, this is specifically referring to in the book of Revelations, where it talks about Babylon will be the downfall of the new world empires and things such as, which I think this is basically referring to the idea that there will be strength rise up from the east, so to speak. However, that's all speculation. What I believe the conspiracy is referring to is just this idea in Revelations, and the idea that at some point there will be a leader rise up in the Middle East who will dominate control of at least several world powers. Depopulation funds is very closely related to the planned extinction I talked about earlier. When it comes to this, everything I could find mostly related back to Bill Gates and ideas that money is being put into several ecological departments that are studying things such as, and everything else I could find on it related back to the idea that they are planning to get rid of what they refer to as useless eaters, which is actually a term originally coined in Nazi Germany and just refers to people who take up space in a population without contributing. So if it ever got to a point where we were losing our ecosystem fast and we had to immediately correct the human population, the first to go would be these useless eaters, or whoever the government rules is not fit to continue, basically. SCPs based on real life is just saying one of two options: that either the SCP Foundation is real and that all the logs have been linked by disgruntled SCP agents, or some real-life supernatural phenomena is hidden in SCP files, both to keep the identity of the person who uploaded it safe and to warn whatever few people may read it of what's really out there. I personally like the second one more since it's at least sort of plausible. So yeah, holotropic breathwork is a practice that is found in a lot of yogi circles, especially Chinese and other Eastern philosophies. It's the idea that quick, fast breaths for time periods up to even 3 hours can cause the body to sort of reset itself and be more in touch with the inner self. And from this, you can derive true knowledge, spiritualism, and whatever have you for the situation. Hermeneutics is about critiquing things from a sense of inner self. Basically, everything I could find on it is just the idea that if there's a literary text or some other form of media that you're trying to understand, that you have to embellish from the self in order to truly understand it, and that people talking doesn't really accomplish anything without meditation. Almost every application I could find of this related to the Bible, and there are several people who have their own interpretations of the Bible using hermeneutics. The Sea People were interesting. When I saw the title, I thought this would just be referring to Atlantis fish people or whatever, but it's not at all. From 1200 to 900 BC, there was a group of people who are only known in history as the Sea People, who went around the Mediterranean Sea fighting different nations, famously of which was Egypt around 1000 BC. These people were supposed to be taller than the average person, no specific mention of giants, just that they were rather large, and they were great fighters and plunderers, and from everything I read, the earliest possible version of pirates. What's interesting is no one knows where they came from. About every other player around the Mediterranean was noted for at that time, and to this day no one knows where the Sea People came from or where they went, and they just forever remain this kind of blip in history. Cryptogeography is exactly what it sounds like how cryptozoology is the study of paranormal animals, cryptogeography is the study of paranormal spaces. So Bermuda Triangle, haunted sites, yada yada. Infrared laundry balls is the fact that laundry detergent balls that supposedly, even in advertising for them, mention that they clean clothes with an infrasonic wave, actually elicit enough of the stuff to harm the individual. However, whenever companies say stuff like that, they're just using big words to try to talk over people's head and make them think they know what they're doing, because no, they don't. Neg entropy, or negative entropy, is a concept that exists in thermal physics. The idea is all sources of energy derive from heat in some regard. They either bring heat in or let it out. And any action of energy dispels heat in some way. This makes sense if you think about it more. However, a theoretical negative entropy item would bring in heat or ambient energy in the air whenever it performs a task or does any function. This would theoretically cause a sort of paradoxical loop in which something can be done without taking in energy, and as a matter of fact, creating more of it while also doing more. So this could spiral on forever and ever, and if you read theories on this, in the universe. So that's cool. I'll be honest, I could not find anything on Nexus 7. There was one website called Nexus 7 that had a few creepy articles on it, but that was the name of the website and not a conspiracy in general. Nexus 7 is both the name of the Android laptop or pad or tablet, whatever it is, and another theory for the movie Blade Runner that one of the characters was a Nexus 7 model. So anything I look up for theory or analysis goes to one of the two, and I have absolutely no idea what this could be referring to unless the tablet or the character from Blade Runner has a conspiracy behind it. It's come to my attention at this point that when this is all over, I'll need to do a corrections video because there's a few other minor details I messed up on. So if anyone can tell me in the comments what this Nexus 7 thing means, I will absolutely give you credit for it, and I can quit trying to look up pictures of tablets. So yeah, sorry about that, but I promise I tried. The Black Hope Curse is an interesting one. In Houston, Texas, there was a family that moved into a small suburb and immediately began noticing odd things happening around their house. Until one day, an old man showed up and told them that they had bodies in their backyard. The family didn't believe him, but after digging up the backyard, they discovered that there was in fact 2 dead bodies buried side by side. It turns out the neighborhood was built on top of an old slave cemetery, the name of which was Black Hope Cemetery. The family reburied the bodies and set up a memorial for them, however things kept getting worse around the house. At first it was subtle, such as a missing pair of shoes here, or a slight noise down the hallway there, until eventually it became more malicious. Things that were being lost in the house were found on top of the graves in the backyard. After doing research, the mother figured out that these 2 were a buried slave couple. And she felt that by disturbing their grave, she had made them angry. This led to an eventual legal battle with the neighborhood because they sold them a house and didn't tell them there was bodies under it, to which the judge said he would need definitive proof that there were bodies under the house. The mother, in a rage, went back home and began digging up around her yard. Her daughter, who was helping her, came across another body, said she felt ill, and immediately had a seizure, and then died 2 days later in a hospital. The family moved out of the house, the bodies were covered up, and to this day it says that the Black Hope Curse still resides in Houston, Texas. Falun Gong is an interesting one, as it seems to be a religion that's derived from Chinese philosophy that also went at odds with the Chinese government. Although initial reports are mixed of why this rivalry started, we know it got to the point that there was about 70 million Falun Gong members who all stood at odds with the Chinese government. This became a total smear campaign in which the government was blocking the word Falun Gong online, throwing various members in prison. It's even estimated that about 2,000 Falun Gong members were killed while in prison. What's even more interesting is that this religion and the founders of it went on to found the Epoch Times, which is now a pretty well-known news source that constantly talks bad about the Chinese government, and seeing where they came from, you could kind of guess why. Geometrodynamics is sort of the theoretical geometry to theoretical physics, and the idea that natural phenomenon and the universe itself can be described and quantitated through geometry. So Super next level math stuff. Tor, owned by the government, is in reference to the internet browser Tor, also known as the Onion, which lets people access the dark web. What's funny is this conspiracy iceberg was written in 2017, and it has since been proven without a shadow of a doubt that Tor is absolutely run by the government. Not only was it only created to perform government ops and things such as on unlisted websites, but it is also known that they monitor certain transactions on it in order to figure out where people are and what they're doing, and certain upkeep cost for the Tor browser is funded by certain state departments, if secretly so. So yeah, look at this, all grown up. Something that was on the conspiracy iceberg, now making its way into headlines. Isn't that cute? Cave Dweller Holocaust, while I couldn't find a very specific instance, is in reference to the idea that there were at one point at least two different kinds of humanoid creatures, one of which being us, the other being troglodytes, or cave-dwelling creatures. The idea being that at some point we hunted and killed these troglodytes either out of self-defense or just to stay at the top of the food chain. This relates to several old world mythologies and stories relating to a troglodyte or cave dweller type creature, but obviously none existing in our present sense. The Trilateral Commission is a board that was founded in 1973 by John Rockefeller, and yes, that's the Rockefeller name. They meet twice a year in Tokyo, Japan, and the board is made up of United States, Western European, Japanese, and Canadian members who discuss, kind of like the Bilderberg meetings, capitalism and other adult things. I don't know what they say they do. It's absolutely rife with conspiracies. Like reading about these people, they get blamed from everything from 9/11 to John F. Kennedy, even though they didn't exist yet. So yeah, super creepy top 1% elitist, meet every year and talk about stuff. Also, I should mention, especially with that one, I'm at the point in researching this stuff that whenever I type some of this in, the first results are what